Appendix N. This is part of DCC Days Online, and we're streaming to the official Goodman Games channel. So I'm Joseph Goodman of Goodman Games. I'm going to moderate this, and I figured we'd start by just letting the panelists kind of introduce themselves a little bit. So I was going to say starting to my right or left, but that gets all screwed up in Zoom. So whoever wants to start, just go ahead, and then maybe introduce yourselves and tell everybody why you're qualified to talk about the swords and sorcery of Appendix N.
I'm John C. Hocking, Chris Hocking. I wrote Conan and the Emerald Lotus and an armload of short stories in the sword and sorcery realm. I was a gamer back in the day, white box D&D. Haven't done that for a long time, but I've been obsessed with the sword and sorcery, reading and writing it since the beginning, since for me, what's 1972, 73. I don't know if that qualifies me for much of anything, but I can talk about sword and sorcery, and I'm here to do that.
Dad's death. That was great.
James?
Okay, I'll go. I'm Michael Curtis. You might know me as one of the Goodman Games stable of writers. I'm also kind of our in-house Appendix N armchair scholar. I have done extensive research with Fritz Leiber as part of the DCC Lankbar line, including going down to University of Houston and spending a week going through the Leiber papers down there. I have done the work with the Shutter Mountains, which is heavily draws for the work on Manly Wade Wellman. I am a Tolkien aficionado and have done extensive readings on his work, and have a general all-around understanding and appreciation for most of the Appendix N authors. So that's why I'm here this evening.
Cool. I'm James Enge. If you want to pronounce that James Enge, that's okay with me because it's not really my real name. It's a pen name. I've written a bunch of sword and sorcery stuff, mostly about Morlock Ambrosius, Merlin's son. I'm continuing to do so under the auspices of Tales from the Magician's Skull, which I think is awesome for a bunch of reasons, not just because they buy Morlock stories. Am I qualified to talk about sword and sorcery? I'm not sure. I mean, I've read a lot of it. I've been obsessed by it ever since I found a copy of Swords and Deviltry on a used bookstore. That great Jeff Jones cover of I don't know what the hell is going on in that cover, but I knew I had to have that book. And although I was already into fantasy, this got me into sword and sorcery. So I've been reading it forever, writing it obsessively. And I can talk about it. Whether I can talk coherently about it, I guess we'll see.
I guess I'm the same way. I can talk coherently about it, maybe. And one of the first things I ever picked up was Swords Against Death, also with that great cover. Blew me away. I'm Howard Jones. That's the one. I'm the editor of Tales from the Magician's Skull, which you see behind me here. Joseph Goodman's partner in crime. And I've also written a slew of sword and sorcery stuff, the historical Arabian flavored stuff of the Dabir and Asim, the allegedly epic fantasy trilogy that I'm writing, which is really sword and sorcery, starting with The Killing of Kings, and then a bunch of different sword and sorcery characters in a bunch of different magazines over the years. And I guess, yeah, I'd like to think I could talk coherently. I spent a lot of years tracking down the works of Harold Lamb and getting those back into print. And of course, Harold Lamb, I think, is the unsung grandfather of sword and sorcery. So those are my bona fides.
That's great. So I'm going to pause for a minute to address the audience. Audience, can you guys hear us? We want a quick sound check to make sure that everybody can hear us. So somebody chat back, I guess, if you can hear us or can't hear us, one way or the other. And then a quick comment on, the world of quarantine. We're obviously all still, broadcasting from our homes, which is also just a chance to show off our book collections. So maybe at the end of this, you guys can tell us who has the coolest book collection, because clearly we have 5 strong competitors here. But, I just have to throw it out there. I have 2 kids, and they inevitably, interrupt these things. So if you see me go dark, that's why. We're all doing this from home. I hear some of these guys have dogs that make them wandering into the room. So, work with us here as we try to navigate this modern world. Excellent. So we have several people saying they can hear us just fine. So sound check's complete. So the purpose of this seminar is to talk about Appendix N. I'm sure most of you guys know that was in the back of the AD&D or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide that Gary Gygax wrote think it was in 82, I think it was published.
No, I think 77 or 78.
78, actually. Yeah, that's right. And I believe Gygax's original point of that was just to list off all the books that he felt helped inspire the creation of D&D, gave him inspiration one way or the other. Even mentioned some comic books in the introduction, but then listed all these authors and titles and so on. And something that, we wanted to talk about in general was Swords and Sorcery specific elements of that list. But then Howard made a comment the other day that got me thinking. And he basically said, Gygax assembled this list based on what he could find at his local bookstore in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And for those of you who have visited Lake Geneva, it's a fine town, but it is not New York City. So it is quite possible that there was amazing fantasy literature available that just never crossed paths with him. Or in some cases, we discussed how there are great authors who simply came along a year or two or three after when he was doing the most of his reading, and therefore he missed them in his list. So part of the point of this discussion today is not just to discuss what's in Appendix N as Sword and Sorcery, but what was maybe, not quite included due to luck of the draw or incorrect timing or so on, or just wasn't in print anymore at that time, but was in print 10 years earlier. And nowadays, everything's in print thanks to the internet. So we wanted to talk about just the way we've all been inspired by Appendix N and then things that branch out from it and that broader sense of Swords and Sorcery. And we had a little brainstorming session a couple days ago, and everybody had some fantastic ideas. But I figured I would kick it off to Howard first because he loves talking about Harold Lamb, who was one of Robert E. Howard's big inspirations. And Howard got me hooked on Harold Lamb. So I've read 2 or 3 volumes of the Harold Lamb anthology that Howard edited, and it's awesome. And maybe Howard, just tell us why you think Harold Lamb is such a star in the world of Swords and Sorcery.
Well, sure. I think first I should talk about why I don't think he ended up in Appendix N. Lamb was in print for decades because after he stopped writing for the pulps and all these wonderful adventure stories, he continued to write histories and biographies. And so in 78, you could have walked into a whole bunch of libraries and found Lamb still on the shelf, but it wouldn't have been any of his fiction. The other thing, of course, is that he wrote historical adventure stories. Now, I think that they're about as close as you can get to Sword and Sorcery without being set on a planet, without a different planet, without having magic involved, because all of the other tropes are there. You've got a wandering warrior on quests to deal with villains and hidden fortresses and assassins, and a lot of the chapters begin with really nifty quotes, which are actually pulled from real sources as opposed to invented the way all of us Sword and Sorcery writers do. He started work on the most famous of these cycles. There's about 18 of them, of these novellas, starring a wandering Cossack. And he started working like 1917 on these. And it's, when I describe people, I say, well, it's fairly modern pacing. I think people are surprised when they get there and they say, yeah, it really is fairly modern pacing. They kind of pull you forward. They're atmospheric. There's mystery. There's mayhem. It's grand stuff. I once described it, he's kind of like an American Dumas. Imagine you've never heard of the Three Musketeers and you suddenly come upon the Three Musketeers and read it for the first time. You'd be blown away. Well, that's kind of what I discovered when I sat down at, 14 or 15, and I just stumbled upon a short collection of the Cossack stories by Harold Lamb. It blew me away.
That's actually the perfect age to stumble on a lot of this stuff. I mean, I enjoyed reading it 2 or 3 years ago, thanks to your recommendation, but if I'd read it when I was a teenager, it would have been even more awesome.
I loved Lamb as a kid, but it was his historicals, his histories. Genghis Khan, Emperor of All Men, the March of the Barbarians. I mean, their history written better than most novels. So I loved Lamb from the time I was a teenager. I had no idea he wrote fiction.
It was weird how I stumbled into him. In high school, I think it was, I read his biography of Hannibal. Like you said, it was a page turn. It's like, wow, this is so cool. This Hannibal guy's so interesting. And I went to the library to see if I could find more. And I saw this novel he'd written. I thought it was a novel called The Curved Saber. Well, I was too young to know that Carthaginians didn't have sabers. I thought, oh, maybe it's more about Hannibal. Well, no, it was a collection written reprinted in 1969 that had, 9 of the original Cossack stories in it. And by that point, I'd read Swords Against Death. like, wow, this kind of reminds me of Fritz Leiber, not knowing, of course, that it had been written 30 or more years before Lankhmar ever came around.
Yeah, Lamb, I can never remember the name of the story. He has so many great stories, but remember the one with the lake? There's this one that has this lake and then a small island in the middle of the lake and then a citadel or a tower. Yeah.
My favorite.
Yes, it's so good. Like I want to reprint that somewhere. It's so good. And then I can't give away the story, but it involves, this guy with pseudo supernatural powers kind of saving the day in the end. But there's this lone Christian warrior who lives inside this tower, and he's besieged by hundreds of warriors, across the shores around the lake. And then winter sets in and they have to cross the ice, and they defend the tower with, I think there's only 3 of them in the tower, right? Or maybe 4. Yeah. And there's so many little escapades there as they defend the tower, and then the ending is awesome. Anyway, yeah, it's so good. Like I've read that story through twice, and we'll probably read it again next year. It sticks with you.
Yeah, just label them historical fiction. You tend to think of that as being, I don't know, more predictable, more standard. A lot of the environments that the stories take place in are like you described, really dramatic, and some of them kind of surreal. I think in the same one, but they have to make their way through a field of mammoth bones that have been there forever.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's any number of really picturesque and vivid scenes that make it almost seem like fantasy. It's certainly anyone expecting to read sword and sorcery fantasy, I don't think they'd be disappointed reading these.
Yeah, and like the final scene where there's a guy who's basically a druid or a ranger, he can communicate with natural animals. And to save the day, to eliminate the enemy horde, he wants to run them down with basically a giant herd of wild reindeer, to sort of trample them and panic them and so on. And so he gets the reindeer herd, but the only way he can think of to motivate them to get to the tower fast enough, as I recall, is to have them attacked by wild wolves. So he drives them through like the wolf hunting land. So the wolves then start chasing the reindeers. So then the reindeers run really fast to outrun the wolves, and then by the time they get there, they trample all the bad guys. And anyway, the wolves then attack as well. It's such a good ending. It's such a good story.
It's exactly how Mowgli killed Shere Khan in the Jungle Books.
Whoa.
It was buffalo.
Oh, okay.
But they were driven by wolves, Mowgli's brothers. So I mean, there's a great sense of literary history in Lamb too. I mean, the guy had read a few books, and he could tell a crazy story. God, I love that stuff.
Yeah.
The Cossacks wander all over places that sound well to people who are used to reading only medieval Western fantasy. Then they'll be blown away by the depictions of the East. I mean, he's pursued at one point by almost the entire Chinese army because they think that he's killed the Chinese emperor. And just the way he managed to survive that. Imagine the army's like, I don't know what, like a million men or something trying to hunt him down. It's wonderful.
You can imagine Robert E. Howard reading that and getting a grin on his face. That would have agreed with him.
Yeah, and Lamb was one of Robert E. Howard's favorite writers, and I wish we knew for certain whether or not he read the earlier Cossack stories. We know that he read some of the later ones starring another pair of heroes, and Robert E. Howard even wrote a poem about those Cossack guys. Unfortunately, the poem's lost. We just know he wrote about it because he titled it in their names. Wouldn't that have been great to see?
Yeah.
Well, there's more to Lamb than Clit the Cossack, right? There's
the Crusader stories, and again, though, most of the Crusaders are traveling east, right into Mongolian lands, meeting up with the Horde or joining forces with Muslims and having adventures. It's just grand, sweeping stuff.
And he's not Eurocentric. I mean, it's not like he exoticizes the locations more than they actually are. They're realistic in their own terms. It's I don't know. It's very satisfying to read. I read that stuff, especially the stuff about. Well, for me, the fictionalized version of Genghis Khan's life as a young man is Temujin. But they're all outsiders. Like the sword and sorcery hero is an outsider. They're traveling, but it's not usually like on a noble quest. It's more like they just sort of happen into it somehow.
Right.
anyway.
Yeah, we could probably do an entire panel just on how awesome Harold Lamb is, but
Yeah. I was surprised at how much ground it covered. I mean, there's even a swashbuckling version of the U.S. Navy taking on the Barbary pirates in one of them, isn't there?
oh yeah, that's called the Drub Devil March, and that was one of his later ones for Argosy. Yeah, that's in the collection Swords from the Sea.
Well, that's a ripping yarn.
Yeah, it really is. He knew what to do.
So we basically think if Gygax had access to this and read it, it probably would have made Appendix N. It certainly would, it sounds like we all appreciate it.
I would like to think so.
Yeah.
That the first collections of the Clip of Cossack stuff had appeared in the late 60s, but were they around in local bookstores? I just don't know how readily available it was at that time. And certainly it might not have been screaming, hey, this is fantasy literature, you got to pick it up.
Yeah. So now I'm going to switch gears to another author and Michael Curtis, this one's for you. This author is actually in Appendix N, which is Manly Wade Wellman. And I think we've all, everybody's heard about Silver John through many other projects Mike has worked on. But Mike, maybe tell us about, you were mentioning another one of those stories that Wellman wrote that you thought was quite good.
Yeah, I have another character, and actually I've just picked up a second one too. The after doing the Silver John stories, the next thing that's kind of in the more of the classic sword and sorcery, well, not even sword and sorcery, but the classic kind of barbaric fiction that Conan kind of treads the line through as everything, would be the character that he came up with. Originally, I think it was going to be just a standalone story. It was going to be Battle in the Dawn was the name of it, and that introduced the character which became known as Hawk the Mighty. And Hawk the Mighty is good rip-roaring caveman fiction. That's right. It's
I brought my copy. Mike got me reading this. It's really good.
As we were discussing, the cover of the Planetary Stories one does not really reflect, what's going on in there. But it's basically Hawk the Mighty discovers everything. It's it's pretty much it's like Hawk. I think there's one is like Hawk fires the bow, or whatever it is, and then he has adventures where he goes to Atlantis, which is it's not kind of what we think of Atlantis. It's on the edge of the Mediterranean, and there's like a giant land dam which is like keeping back the Atlantic Ocean, and of course Hawk being Hawk ends up moving the wrong thing, and basically causes the entire dam to collapse in the Mediterranean Ocean to flood into the basin and destroys Atlantis. There's another one where I think it's a Hawk. I think that might be one of the last ones in the story, but it's like Hawk and the Land of Legends. And he goes and he runs into like the surviving dinosaurs or large prehistoric mammals which are dealing there. He's just a great character. I love him. It's just, he's so fun because literally he is that he's like uber caveman. He is the Conan of cavemen. He's the one who's going around every week and having a picaresque adventure. There's one which is it's not a Hawk the Mighty story, but it has to do kind of with his tribe, which are I think they're like the Flint people, I think, or something like that. It's been a little while since I remember, but it's the Flint people basically run into Martians. It was it's like so while there's not a lot of out and out like sorcery that we think of like Appendix N stuff, there's a lot of superstition, and it really treads that line between legend and semi pseudo historical stuff. And Wellman is great because he puts little footnotes in some of the stories, like Hawk will describe like encountering some beast or something, and then Wellman kind of acting as like the armchair scholar, which is like what Hawk is actually encountering is a Diliptolopolis, and then just kind of pauses out, so if those of you following along at home can figure out what exactly is going on. So that's really what I got into after I finished up the Silver John stories, and then I just loved it so much because if anyone who knows my adventure Frozen in Time I have like a little fondness for that caveman meets kind of fantasy, like Frozen in Time is cavemen versus time travelers, so this was right up my alley.
And I have to say it's really good. It's hard to say why, because it's just nothing about it's outstanding, but it's just good adventure stories, and it's It's entertaining, and it is kind of like you said. It's like Mighty Warrior set in caveman era, which somehow is very satisfying. It's just really entertaining. And you're right. He discovers the bow. Then he discovers the land of the mammoths. Then he discovers it's like one thing after another. The sword. Remember, he discovers the first sword. It's like
right. Hawk discovers iron.
Yeah.
It's literally like he single-handedly brought civilization to the Paleolithic era. It's like,
yeah.
Be the first to ride as well. It's been too long since I've read it.
I'm sorry. What was that?
Is there a story where he first rides the horse, or do I have it confused with the H.G. Wells story about
I think in the Land of Legend, I think he does, because he encounters horsemen for the first time, and there's like a great line. It's like, it is a man but not a horse, and it is a horse but not a man. And I think at that point, like Wellman chimes in, is like, this is probably where the centaur legend come from, and like he steps back in again. So. So, but that's I think by the end of that, he's knowing Hawk, he's probably on a horse, and he's probably tamed like 6 horses, and he brings them back to the Flint people, and that's just the way that he rolls. So, so that was my introduction to kind of Wellman's like out and out fantasy stuff, which is in the Appendix N, Wellman is listed, but we don't really get any stories. But for the longest time, a lot of people were saying that was the Silver John thing, because the Silver John is kind of the inspiration for the Bard character. But it's quite possible that maybe Gygax had read a little bit of the maybe some of the Hawk the Mighty and just didn't call it out.
It's possible, but I mean, a lot of the Appendix and stuff, you read it and you're like, oh, this is where polychromatic spray comes from. Like, some of it's so directly referenced in D&D. I haven't come across anything in this that feels like, oh, that's straight from D&D.
Right. There's actually, after I finished Hawk the Mighty just recently, Wellman did another kind of line of stories which was more in the sword and sorcery vein, and that is Cardios of Atlantis. Do any of you guys know Cardios of Atlantis?
Right.
Yeah.
They were out of print for quite some time, and they just reprinted a bunch of this in this Heroes of Atlantis and Lemuria, and so
I gotta check that out.
Yeah, it's all of Manly Wellman's Cardios of Atlantis stories, and there's also Frederick Arnold Kummer Jr. I don't know if his name does not ring any bells, but apparently he did this epic Lemuria story. And then, just like to tack one on at the very end, there's a Lee Brackett one which takes place on Moo. So it's just like, so they could just put Lee Brackett's name on the cover along with the other guy that you didn't hear from and the guy you might have heard from.
Yes. Mike, you have to send me the link to that book afterwards.
Yeah. You want to know something? You could probably pass on Cardios of Atlantis. This is my impression of it, is that Wellman had a lot of success with Silver John, and he said, what if I do like a Silver John character in like a kind of fantasy setting? So it's very picaresque. It's every week Cardios has a new adventure. Cardios, going along with the Hawk thing, he single-handedly brings about the sinking of Atlantis. So he's the only survivor of Atlantis. He washes up on the shore on like a gate, and meanwhile, Atlantis is plunged into the Atlantic. And so he ends up, by the end of the first story, he has a harp and he has a sword. He's singing songs as he's going along. So it gives Wellman that excuse to like write like these, to engage in his songwriting that he did so much with the Silver John stories.
Yeah.
And it's where the Silver John stories, the dialogue is half the fun of it, because the dialogue sounds so authentic to that kind of, that Carolina's Appalachian mountain. The dialogue in the Cardio stories sounds too contemporary. Like it's almost, you expect it like, it's Cardi's like, hey, cool it, man, because like, it's written in like, it's like 75, 76 or something like that. And it's just, the first one is probably the best. I made it through 4 of them, and I think you did 5 of them. So if you're a completionist, check it out. But I wouldn't say you definitely have to read this. But knowing Gygax's taste, if he had this available, he might have actually, this might have influenced the Appendix N. He might have been thinking a couple of these stories, but apparently Wellman didn't start writing these until the 70s, because his excuse was that Robert E. Howard had sewn up the Atlantean story. So he basically, but Howard stopped publishing Cull in like 30 whatever. Howard, you probably know.
He only wrote like 3 of them or 4 of them, right? Like,
And so I don't know if like Manly Wade was just talking out his butt or whatever. He was just but it seems odd. Like I can't write any Atlantean stories because Cull was written in 32 or before the, I mean, so for 40 years,
Yeah.
I don't know, but if you're a Wellman completionist, there's 5 stories you can knock it off in a day. No.
And actually, to answer one of the questions from the chat, yeah, we will publish a list of all these authors and story names and so on. We'll put it on the website in a week or two because this is a great list we're developing already, and I'm sure people want to reference it. So, and actually, I have a shout out from the chat that I wanted to mention. James, we have somebody named John R. Foltz who says hi.
Oh yeah, I hate him too in the chat.
Okay, great. All right, cool. And James, maybe I'll toss it to you now. I know you had mentioned you're a big fan of John Bellairs. I don't know if you want to talk about him or some other author from the sword and sorcery perspective.
Yeah, both kind of, because the Face in the Frost is the big fantasy work by John Bellairs. Probably what I forget if that's listed as the reason Bellairs is on the Appendix N. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And it's obvious why. I mean, if you read the book, it's about a couple of sorcerers who are having this conflict with an evil sorcerer, and they go on journeys and they have adventures. And it's very much on the sorcery rather than the sword side of sword and sorcery. But you can see how it would inform all sorts of gameplay. And it's a great book. Lynn Carter hailed it as one of the 3 great fantasy novels that have been published since Lord of the Rings. That was in Imaginary Worlds, I think. I don't completely agree with him about all 3 of those, but definitely Face in the Frost is hilarious, but it's also very scary, and I think that's another reason why it makes a good why it's really important in the history of sword and sorcery, even though there's no swords, is that horror is an essential element, I think, in the background of a sword and sorcery. You can see it all over the place in
agree more.
Liber, historical fiction is there, the Western is there, but horror is definitely there. And Bellairs is a great writer of horror in a really creepy, personal way. He knows what it's like to be alone in a basement on a summer night and be freaked out by the shadows down there. He has a great sense of the personal, striking nature of horror. So his monsters are scary, not because they have a million fangs, but because they're so personal. It's such a personal attack on the hero and through the hero on the reader. So, but it's also very funny. And I don't know if you guys saw Shirley. It would be in theaters now if theaters were like open. But Elizabeth Moss plays Shirley Jackson, who is not quite an Appendix N author, but super interesting, and a great writer of horror. Just ordinary human beings being completely horrible, but also of humor. And I think they go well together. And in that movie, they're both kind of absent. But Bellairs' book combines them both really brilliantly with the kind of reckless inventiveness that you don't often see in a fantasy novel. I mean, it's not your standard 3 spells. I mean, it's a really interesting approach to magic. Totally unsystematic. Anyway, it's a million laughs, and he wrote it and about 100 pages of a sequel, and then he switched to kids' books, and he had a great long career as a writer of young adult fiction, starting with The House with a Clock in Its Walls.
Okay.
Louis Barnevelt is the young hero of that one, and there's a creepy uncle and a creepy sorcerer neighbor, and they have, got that Bellairs combination of horror and humor. But I always wish he'd gone back and written some more of the stories about Prospero the magician in Face in the Frost. So anyway, that's my pitch on Bellairs.
You said there's a sequel, like or a partially written sequel?
Yeah, it's what the hell is it called? It's collected in this Nespa volume. I don't know if you can see it through the reflections.
Yeah.
Magic Mirrors. Prospero has a magic mirror who's always mouthing off to him, playing 1945 Yankees games and things like that. The Dolphin Cross is the name of the sequel. And in this volume, there's a great memoir by Ellen Kushner, the modern writer of fantasy, who was working as a young woman at Ace Books and advocated the publication of Face in the Frost as a paperback. It was the first paperback publication. And she developed a real friendship with this guy. And he sent her a copy of the incomplete manuscript.
Oh, wow.
But I don't know, he had all sorts of like weird personal issues. Unlike us, we're all completely healthy mentally. But Belair is, seems to have been something of an agoraphobe. He wrote The Face in the Frost in England, which he described as a year in England, which he described as the most miserable of his life. Maybe he couldn't ever get miserable enough to write a book that good again. I don't know.
That's pretty funny.
But,
all right, I'll have to check that out. I didn't know there was a partial sequel. That's cool.
It's frustrating in the way of fragments.
Yeah.
Because not only is it unfinished, every now and then there's a page missing. Oh, damn it! But that's life.
It's a fragmented fragment, is basically what
Exactly.
it is.
I want the fragments missing from this fragment.
Yeah, right.
And the author that I guess in retrospect I was surprised that wasn't on the list is Ursula Le Guin, the Wizard of Earthsea, and its first sequel anyway, Tombs of Atuan. Those are tremendous books about lone adventurers who work magic. There's my assistant, dog detective Lenny Briscoe. If there was going to be a revised standard version, I definitely lobby for the inclusion of Wizard of Earthsea.
Okay, I'm gonna have to check that out. My brother is a huge Ursula Le Guin fan, and for some reason I just never got into her. But maybe sometimes you read the wrong story by an author and you read another one and it clicks. So I will check those out.
She had a lot of different careers. I mean, she wrote sociological science fiction, some of which really strikes me a lot more than other parts of it. Her last novel was like the 13th book of the Aeneid, the Roman epic.
Is that a compliment or not?
For me, it's a compliment. What can I say? But yeah, she had a very, very diverse career. But Wizard of Earthsea is awesome.
Many things.
And again, it has that horrific element. When the sorcerer is wandering alone and he realizes he's about to be attacked by the shadow that he himself has evoked, I mean, it's terrifying. It still creeps me out.
Did Le Guin do Left Hand of Darkness? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, all right. That's one of those books that I read a lot. I read like that and Solaris like in 2 weeks back to back, and I really need to go back and redo those again.
That would be a harrowing weekend.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think Left Hand of Darkness is very readable. It's an adventure story, a love story, but yeah, there's a lot to wrap your head around in that.
She had so many different styles of books. Some of them I bounced off of them, and some of them I loved. I was always kind of a little bit positive on the Wizard of Earthsea. Like you said, the first two I liked much more than the other. When I read them, there were only 3. The one that I loved the most was the Lathe of Heaven. That's science fiction one, yeah. I must have watched it a few times.
She's had terrible luck in film adaptations of her works, but there was a pretty good TV movie of The Lathe of Heaven.
Yes, there was. Not the second one, but the first one.
Yeah, it was on PBS, like a billion years ago. Well,
like a immense budget, but they did pretty good, even though they didn't have a whole lot of money behind it.
Yeah.
So if only Gygax had a different bookstore that happened to be stocking Ursula Le Guin.
He should have stayed in Chicago is what he should have done.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I know. So Chris, let's hear from you. You had a couple good suggestions, one of which was in Appendix N and one of which was not. I'm curious to hear your
Let's
thoughts.
start with the Appendix N one.
Okay.
Gygax called out Andrew Offutt for Swords Against Darkness, which makes perfect sense as that's a sort of keystone sword and sorcery anthology of the 70s. All great volumes. I think there's 5 of them. If you're into sword and sorcery, you don't want to miss them. It's cool that he pointed them out. But Offutt also followed up did pastiche adventures of Robert E. Howard's characters, Cormac MacArt and the Gale back in the era of King Arthur, and Cormac MacArt's right-hand man, Wolfhere Skullsplitter, Norse warrior. The books come in sort of two trilogies, following up the original Tigers of the Sea, which is the Robert E. Howard collection that has the original stories of Cormac MacArt in it. And these titles, I think went through, if you can see them, they went through a single printing way back in the day, and they're quite excellent. The first trilogy, good strong stuff, great historical flavor, swashbuckling action, totally worth having if you like sword and sorcery. But the second series, which was most of them were written in, I think 2 of the 3 of them were written with Keith Taylor, famous for his Bard series. And it seems to me a crime that these 3 volumes, Mists of Doom one's by Andrew Offutt alone. Tower of Death, which is written with Keith Taylor. And this particular title, really strong sword and sorcery with a dense H.P. Lovecraft vibe. In this case, your 2 Howardian characters, Cormac MacArt and Wolfhere Skullsplitter, go up against Lovecraft's Deep Ones, straight out of Shadow over Innsmouth. Great stuff if you're in that Weird Tales mood. And then the third of the set, When Death Birds Fly, it is an excellent sword and sorcery novel with a memorable villain who meets an incredibly appropriate doom. Great stuff. The fact that I can't imagine that, given the fact that Gygax was willing to call out Swords Against Darkness, I can't imagine he wouldn't have enjoyed those. That's some strong sword and sorcery. And one of the problems, I don't know, maybe with modern publishing, is I've seen an awful lot of fantasy novels, good and bad, come and go through reprint, and I don't think these things have been reprinted since they originally appeared in the late 70s, early 80s. Seems a crime.
I think I recognize several of those covers, so I probably have them in my stash of books. I think one of you guys said your pile of to-be-read books is taller than yourself. I have one of those too. So yeah, I'll have to look those up.
I'm pretty sure I've seen
used bookstores are awesome for that, because especially back in those days, the print runs were so big that books from that era are likely to stay around if the bookstores don't burn down, say, in a civil insurrection. I don't know. But used bookstores and now online bookstores, but you have to know that something's out there.
Yeah, you can't just browse like you used to.
Yeah.
Hey, the Swords Against Darkness anthology, weren't there Cardios stories in those?
Yes,
I was going to say the very first appearance of Cardios of Atlantis was in the Sword Against Darkness, and in fact, after the Sword Against Darkness anthologies died, so did the Cardios stories. So they were only being published in those. So apparently there wasn't a big reprint for them. And having read them, I can see why. So
This might have been getting tough for sword and sorcery in short fiction around then too. There was a boomlet, and then there was a desert. I remember because that's when I was trying to get published first.
So then, Chris, you also had mentioned Michael Shea, if I recall.
Yeah, Michael Shea's latter day, and probably wouldn't. I mean, I can't help but think he would have been an Appendix N, author had he been writing in that era. He came along a little later. Shea, who wrote Niftaleen, I don't know if you can see that. Niftaleen won the World Fantasy Award, so I think it's probably the only volume you could call Sword and Sorcery that's won that kind of an award. It's superb stuff. Shea was influenced strongly by Jack Vance, especially early on, who's of course an Appendix N author, and also by Clark Ashton Smith. The The prose is really rich. It's extremely well written. If you read it out loud, it's like poetry, and it's full of just all manner of memorable, imaginative inventiveness, most of it of a most grisly and bizarre nature. Great fun to read. Almost any one of the individual stories will stick in your mind for a really long time. Shea was multi-talented. He didn't just write good sword and sorcery. He wrote good science fiction. There's an Arkham House collection of his science fiction called Polyphemus, which is superb. And he wrote really memorable horror stories, some of them in a Lovecraftian vein. If anyone who likes to read a story of alien horror, which is, like a science fictional horror story, they need to read his story called The Autopsy. If you've never read The Autopsy and you like stories on alien horror, I promise you it will hit the spot. If there is a more horrific alien anywhere in the annals of science fiction, I'm unacquainted with it. So Shea's Autopsy and virtually anything else the fellow wrote, top-notch stuff.
That's awesome. So guys, I'm a little distracted by something I have to deal with, so I'm going to punt it to somebody else. Actually, anybody else want to chime in, or should I go through my list of authors you guys mentioned who are awesome?
Well, I was just going to say about Arkham House. God, they put out a beautiful book. And I was thinking I got to look up that science fiction collection of Shea, and then that reminded me of Phyllis Eisenstein's Born to Exile, which is sort of fantasy in that it involves teleportation. There's a little bit of sword play. The hero is a bard who can teleport, and that's the only magic in the entire series. But it's enough to get him branded as a witch, so he has to keep on moving. And those stories, I read them first in fantasy and science fiction. They're collected in a beautiful Arkham House volume with art by Stephen Fabian. I think that is the most beautiful book that I've ever seen and owned. But anyway, they were a towering little press. I love those guys.
I love Stephen Fabian. TSR went through a stretch. I think it was in the Ravenloft era where they published a lot of his work. Yeah, and I picked up a couple of compilations recently. It's so good. But he doesn't do original. I tried to get him to do some work for Goodman Games, but he's not. He's a little on the older side. But it's so good, his work, and it's so distinctive. Very few other artists have that look.
Right. He can do fantasy. He can do science fiction. It also has that weird, dreamy look. Like it. There's so much more being suggested than you can actually see.
Yeah.
Chris had mentioned Keith Taylor in conjunction there with Andrew Offutt. And I know you mentioned the Bard series in passing, but that's another thing that really needs to be reprinted. That's some fantastic stuff. And I don't believe that was in Appendix N either. There's some unsung people of real talent there who didn't make it Appendix N. Well, Charles Saunders and the Amaro stuff, for instance.
Yeah.
That is
a little later.
I'm trying to when Amaro came out. I could reach behind me and get the copyright, but I thought that was early to mid 70s, so that should have been right in line.
Yeah, the DAW books would have come out sometime in the 70s. I'm not sure exactly when.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah, everybody should read Amaro. And I love the work that Sword and Soul Press is doing.
Well, I was so disappointed that Dark's it went a Nightshade went out of print, but they I thought they were going to bring all of them back and match sets, and it just didn't work out. Yeah, it's a bummer. But another small press took up the challenge and published some more Saunders. Yeah, this guy Milton Davis has been publishing collections and novels of his own, but collections of other like African-centered fantasy, and some of that stuff is amazing. It is, and we printed Milton Davis in issue 4. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he's a giant too.
Howard, I think you brought up an interesting point once, which was that Appendix N has many great authors, but also has some that perhaps aren't the best. And we've all experienced this with some of what we've read. And it's also just that, at that era, when it wasn't like now where the internet is here and you can find a publisher and out of print book anywhere you want. Gygax probably was just so happy to find one more sword and sorcery story that he was,
Well, sure. Yeah. When you're looking at a limited selection of the stuff you like,
yeah,
it's like, well, I guess that one too, that has some cool bits in it. That's sword and sorcery. Well, now we've got a much wider selection. So some of the things on there, like, well, really, I don't know that I ever want to reread that one again or read the second book after I read the first one. But yeah, maybe, I don't know. Should I name names there or just?
I think you're working around some Kothar, aren't you?
It's true. Now I hate maligning Gardner Fox because he did so many things I like. I happen to be a huge fan of some of his historical fiction, but the Kothar stuff is, 1 minute it'll be cooking along. It's like, wow, that's pretty cool, and the next thing it's just so boneheaded. The novels are so slim. I keep thinking, oh, one day I'll finish all of them, and then I tried again a few years ago. I was like, I don't really need to subject myself to this.
If you're in the right mood, they're like cartoons. They're
Right.
Obviously you have to love sword and sorcery to love those, but every now and then they fill a need. They hit a spot.
Right. I think maybe the one that gets the most maligned, who maybe shouldn't be, is he shouldn't be completely maligned. Is Lynn Carter. Most of what he wrote was fan fiction, but scattered in amongst there, I think are a few really nifty pieces. Including one short story I think might even be a minor sword and sorcery masterpiece. But that said,
wait, you have to tell us the name of that story. You can't just like zip by that.
You want me to name that story?
The masterpiece, yes, not the rest.
Well, I'm thinking about it's a story called Zingazar, and it is an unabashed adaptation of a story by Lord Dunsany. Lynn Carter basically stole the plot. But here's the weird thing. You know how a great musician can take someone else's melody, and occasionally some musician of lesser talent can take something by someone of genius level and just do something amazing with it. I don't mean to malign Lynn, who I have a lot of respect for. But this time I think he knocked it out of the park, and Zingazar is a minor masterpiece. It's about this great sword that's somewhat sentient, and about the young boy who uses it to save the city. And he uses Dunsany's story as the template to kind of structure the thing, but he just takes it and improves upon it, I think, at almost every level.
So the Sword of Wellman is the I'm sorry.
Yeah, the Sword of Wellman is the Lord Dunsany story. And until just recently, it was actually kind of hard to get a hold of a copy of the one place where you could find Zingazar, but it's recently been reprinted. I don't know if you can see that or not.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, this is.
I didn't know it had been reprinted. I thought the only place it was available is in The Young Magicians, the old Valentine adult fantasy book.
Yeah, I think it was it wasn't the Young Magicians. It was well, if I step away from the camera, I could go pull it off the shelf. So this is the Lynn Carter Simrana cycle, which actually has all of his Dunsany-esque fiction, and it was edited by Robert Price, the literary executor of Carter's fiction. And I don't think Robert Price thinks nearly as highly of this story as I do, but I think it's fabulous. I think it's one of the best things that Carter ever did. I also am partial to Carter's. I like a lot of his, again, admittedly Dunsany-esque Simrana stories, but I also happen to like his Thongar short stories much more than I ever enjoyed his novels. They're kind of different animals.
Oh, come on. There's a couple good Thongar novels.
Feel about them.
I like it when they get all cosmic. Then it's good.
If you want to read a one Lynn Carter novel that's really awesome, it's this one. It's a Lost World of Time.
Won't argue.
Yeah. Now, it's not a masterpiece, but it's a pretty tasty little sword and sorcery novel. It all makes sense. It's pretty purple. It's pretty pulpy, but it's a grand bunch of fun. You know what?
Like it's a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, like that's a bad thing. Yeah, it's really good stuff. I could name some others, but maybe those are the highlights.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right that we all hoard books clearly, and you find one that has good bits or is, I don't know, you take your top 10 list and you still want to read something. So you read your number 11, then your number 15, then your number 36, and if
Well,
we
yeah, exactly. I
yeah.
could suggest more, but I know other people like some of the fan fiction stuff, and I'm actually a huge fan of his Callisto books, which are his version of the Edgar Rice Burroughs Mars novels. Those are a hoot. You know, they're popcorn reads. All the villains are kind of these snidely whiplash sort of dudes. You know, there's not a whole lot of depth to any of the characters, but man, he had so much fun writing those, and it translated right through the page.
Yeah.
I think his plotting is better than Burroughs. I mean, Burroughs is obviously an immensely inventive writer, much more so in the Mars books than Carter is in the Callisto books. But he can tell more than one story. Whereas in the Burroughs books, the princess gets kidnapped, the hero has to go after her. I mean, I read that Burroughs story like a dozen times at least.
Right.
So yeah, kudos to Carter for being able to tell a story, more than one story.
Yeah, indeed. The Callisto books, that was another. Well, you know, I don't know if I should comment on that definitively because I haven't read them in 20 years, but I remember being impressed. Like, oh, this isn't the same plot each time I'm reading it, unlike the Mars books.
Yeah, I have to agree with you with the Mars books. I read, I think there's 11 of them, and I petered out somewhere around 7 or 8 or something. I was like, this is the same book over and over again.
I think my favorite was Mastermind of Mars.
Oh, that was the little heads, right? Or the
no, he was some weirdo who was experimenting with human beings. But it might have been the Michael Whelan art on the cover that really cemented it in my affection. I have no idea.
I believe but that's the Michael Whelan art that's based on the Roy Krinkle art. Wasn't that the one with the spread out patient on the table and the foreground has the crazy doctor with the weird hypodermic? Yeah, because Roy Krinkle, who was like Frazetta's mentor, did the original of that, and I think Whalen did a interpretation of that image.
Crazy.
If I remember right.
I had no idea.
It's a cool image. Anyway, yeah. So then, Howard, you also seem to like Lee Brackett a lot. She comes up like every time I talk to you, and I've now read more of her because of you than, you know, a lot of other authors.
Lee Brackett was great, and I think if she had created more series characters, or even just written more stories about Eric John Stark, she would be discussed much more often. I see her name bandied about sometimes. If you want to snag her best stuff for a while there, you could get, where is it? This is just a wonderful collection. This is one of those fantasy masterworks from Golanx. And this is Lee Brackett's The Sea Kings of Mars. Look at how thick that baby is. This is a short-ish. In this one volume, you've got nearly all of my favorites. There's a couple up at the front. Well, maybe those are too early to be her very best. But wow, this is grand stuff. I just don't know how affordable it is anymore. I don't think it's in print.
I found the Hafner Press ones are cheaper, which means that that's very expensive indeed.
These are the Hafner Press. Oh my God, these are beautiful. This is how big a Brackett fan I am. So these things each were like $50 when they were first printed, and this is nearly everything she wrote in speculative fiction vein. And my God, she's just fantastic. Like Robert E. Howard and a handful of other writers, I will revisit her every year a little bit. You know, just pure poetry. She writes of a Mars that never was. You know, this faded, dying ruby of a planet where people eke out survival, not in spacesuits because it's got a breathable atmosphere, and there's tombs that were ancient when Egypt was a new civilization on our own planet, and bitter spacemen with checkered pasts, you know, kind of Han Solo-like characters that she created in the 50s, years and years before Star Wars ever existed.
Yeah.
It's just.
I wish that John Eric Stark and Northwest Smith should be hanging out together in a tavern in Mars somewhere. You know, the two, because C.L. Moore's Northwest Smith stories and Lee Brackett's Mars, they're just so they both have the same style to them, but they almost seem like they're existing in the same like literary universe. You know.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I love how it's got elements of space opera, and there's elements of Sword and Planet, and there's elements of Sword and Sorcery. It's just all the great fun stuff. You know, if there's a guy with a ray gun, well, he might be going into some ancient tomb, right? Or transported through time and have to fight with a sword. He didn't care what elements she stole from what genre. She just wrote these great cracking adventure stories that were full of speculative fiction. And if you just want to read one buyer, copies of this slim little volume, and there were multiple covers.
That's great.
This is great.
Yes.
It's short, and you can find it still pretty cheap on any used book search service. And if you like this, you can find more buyer. She was just fantastic.
The Best of Lee Brackett, the old Ballantine volume. Again, it's long out of print, although there might be e-versions now. But that's a good. That's how I caught on to her, and I wish someone had told me about her decades before. Her movie career got in the way. I think she made so much money writing movies.
Yeah, I mean,
for a while, I don't think she was writing fiction at all.
Right.
They were great movies,
When she was on The Big Sleep. If the story is correct, Chandler was like, get that Lee Brackett guy, to adapt it, not thinking, not realizing that Lee Brackett was a woman, thinking it was L.E. So yeah.
Great. Rio Bravo,
right,
and all the Rio movies that came after. Oh God, she wrote a great script, but Jesus, it was great in the 70s when she was writing fiction again, but her career wasn't as long as it should have been.
No, I never read her crime stuff. Before she did like The Big Sleep, she had some success doing like detective, not detective, more like almost hard-boiled crime stuff. Yeah.
She wrote a novel called No Good from a Corpse.
That's the one I'm thinking of.
That's like one of the great lost hard-boiled novels. Really hard to find a copy of that. It is very good indeed. I found a copy and I gave it to Howard, but I don't think he read it.
Weirdly enough, although I've read a bunch of Brackett and I've read a bunch of hard-boiled detective novels since, it's still sitting behind my Tales from the Magician's Skull poster here on my hard-boiled shelf.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've sort of skipped over with Brackett is that she wrote really strong prose. And not to slight anyone else that was writing this sort of stuff in that era, but you can read her stuff out loud. It has a great flow to it. It's a little bit Chandler-esque. It's vivid. There's unexpected, metaphors in it. It's poetic at times, and which really adds to the mood that you were describing, Howard. So that you can swim in these stories. They have real atmosphere.
Well, you said hard-boiled, and there's a hard-boiled tone of loss and regret, even in through all of her stuff. But you don't sometimes expect to find that in pulp fiction, right?
And often a corrupt system. The hero's an outsider. But yeah, that's another reason why Eric John Stark should hang out with Northwest Smith. I mean, C.L. Moore also wrote a very poetic sentence when the mood struck her. Those guys both wrote just beautiful on the sentence by sentence level.
Yeah.
And Eric John Stark is one of the few characters coming out of like from that era who's actually a person of color. He's not a white guy. Although every time he's depicted on a cover somewhere, he's always done as like a white guy with blonde hair. But he's
except for Planet Stories. That was the one. That was the one that depicted
the only
him.
one that actually got it right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the time, nobody was ready to have. I mean, although he was raised on Venus, and that's why his
raised on Mercury, actually.
Mercury, right? And that's why his skin was so dark.
Band, yeah.
So
but he's still
Man Without a Tribe.
Right.
Man Without a Tribe in Chaka, and he's called the Dark Man in some of the prophecies. He's a black hero.
Mm-hmm. But none of the paperbacks wanted to put a man who is clearly black, although he might not have been African American, on the cover as like the heroine. Especially, God forbid, he's got his arm wrapped around a white woman or something, some Venusian woman or everything. That would not sell at all. So
I didn't know that Planet Stories did a cover with an accurate depiction. That's actually cool to hear.
Well, he's referring to the reprint Planet Stories from Paizo.
I know, but I mean, yeah, because I have 2 or 3 versions of the Eric John Stark stories, and you're right, Mike. They're never, the hero is never black, but even though the fiction work is, the art is never That's cool that the Paizo version got it right.
And I suppose we could mention that there was an Eric John Stark trilogy that she wrote in the mid to late 70s because she moved Stark out of her own solar system. It was too late to be writing of Mars with breathable atmosphere anymore. But as much as I like those, and I prefer the earlier Stark stories where he's on Venus or Mars. And there aren't that many of them. I think there's only about 3.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, the Scathe novels, the Reavers of Scathe, and all the rest. That's when he leaves our little solar system. They're entertaining. I mean, because it allows her to indulge a little bit more in that, that kind of more space opera. Because she really kind of builds up with the alien races there. But I'm in agreement. I really do like the Mars and the stuff that takes place like intra solar system. That's much. I prefer those. Yeah.
Right, and those are all in this, and of course they're all in those beautiful Steve Hafner volumes as well. Actually, I think the Stark is all in a single Hafner volume. I believe I'm not sure if he ever printed that or not. It was going to be just the complete book of Stark. It had all the Stark stories.
No, they didn't print that one. Funny enough.
So let me just say this.
Not yet.
I am not going to malign another publisher, but I will speak on my own behalf and certain other people who've had very bad luck pre-ordering things from Hafner Press. Very bad luck. So I would just say for the record, buy the stuff that's in print. Be careful about placing pre-orders with certain publishers. That's all we're going to say. But it may include some of the books that were just discussed.
Well, I've always had luck with Hafner. I've had better luck, including a beautiful collection featuring the Paul Pine detective stories, which it took a little bit longer than expected because the original artist commissioned died, which delayed things, which was pretty terrible. But man, it was lovely to get that, and I sure love having these bracket books. Well, unfortunately, they're so beautiful. I never want to read them while I'm drinking coffee or eating a snack. I just have a paperback like this.
Right. I just learned yesterday, actually, the John Thunstone stories are back in print, but it's not through Hafner, through through another company. They have brought them back, which I'm very excited for because they're the Manly Wave element stories I have not been able to read, and I love the kind of occult detective, that subgenre and everything. So I've been looking forward to reading them.
The Flintstone cover that Hafner did was just amazing. I liked it, I think, just as well as the one that Planet Stories did when they released the Silver John volume. Remember that one of the creepy skeletal thing and Silver John's facing it? Those are great covers.
Hey, Michael, have you seen the movie they made about Silver John back in the 70s?
The Legend of Hillbilly John?
Oh my God.
I have seen parts of it. I may or may not possess a copy of it on my computer hard drive, but it's one of those things you can't watch start to finish, or you can, but much like Kothar, why would you?
Fast forward to the stop motion animated monsters. That's what you got to do.
And maybe if it was Ray Harryhausen doing the stop motion, but it clearly wasn't. It was like Ray Harryhausen's apprentice's cousin.
It's a stop motion animated monster, so I'm probably going to watch it anyway. So yeah, it's a highlight for me at least.
Fair enough, yes. But yeah, I think it's actually available on YouTube. So if anybody's watching tonight, they're looking for something to do after we wrap up, just go to YouTube and type in the Legend of Hillbilly John and see what comes up. So.
Gary.
Where to from here? Carl Edward Wagner.
Oh yeah.
Mark Ashton Smith.
I know nothing about Wagner. I'd like to. I mean, I vaguely know Kane, right? But I've never read any Wagner.
I've read Bloodstone out of the Kane stories. That was it was difficult enough to get the ones that afterward. So it's something. He's always something that I've wanted to read more of, but I just haven't had the opportunity to do. Chris, you've read a lot of the Wagner, right?
Yeah, I read pretty much all the Wagner.
Okay.
It's difficult to get a hold of this stuff now. But hunting up those old paperbacks, if only for their wonderful Frazetta covers, is very much worth your while. Some of these you probably recognize from T-shirts and Vans and what have you. Here's Bloodstone.
Yeah, that's the copy I have. Yeah.
And here's my favorite one. It's Nightwinds. As a collection of short stories. There's a couple of novels in there, and they're good. Wagner has a really sizable fan base that are really enthusiastic about his work. His Sword and Sorcery is hard-boiled, realistic, and shot through with an awful lot of dark magic. Kane is not a straight-up hero. He's more of a villain than anything else. A old-fashioned gothic sort of a villain. Part Conan, part Fu Manchu. And he's an immortal, cursed to live forever. And so he finds his way through all these different adventures, trying to make some sense out of his life and conquer and get what he wants. And some of the stories are spectacular. If you are, I don't know, if you're a pretty big fan of Sword and Sorcery and of say of Robert E. Howard, I wanted to mention from Nightwinds, there's a short story called Raven's Eyrie, which is spectacular. And in the same one, if you like Conan and you haven't read Carl Edward Wagner's short story called Undertow, then you've really missed out on something, because there's a very Conan-esque character plays a role in the story. It's a really memorable horror sword and sorcery yarn. You should check it out. It's delightful. So Wagner also wrote a whole bunch of very memorable, very well-constructed horror stories. Some of the best, I think, since the golden age of weird tales. It's unfortunate they're so hard to get a hold of these days, because it's really good stuff.
What's the holdup with reprinting Wagner?
I don't know all the story. I know some of his stuff's been reprinted in more or less deluxe editions. You can get your hands on them if you're willing to pay for it. But there's been no real paperback or easy to get a hold of edition of these things for some long time. Just unfortunate.
What about the e-editions? I remember reading something a couple years ago that some of the Kane stuff you could find in e-copies again.
If they're out there, I haven't seen it, or maybe I've just missed it.
Crazy. Yeah, who was it that was collecting his stuff? Was it Nightshade?
Nightshade did 2 volumes.
I saw some like omnibus volumes. I thought, boy, that's the one I want. It was like $300 or something like that. I thought, I'm not sure I wanted that much.
Not to get on a discretion, but has Nightshade actually published anything in actual physical form in the longest time? Because every time
they were bought up, so.
Oh, okay. Because every time I get a notification from them, it's always, we have a new ebook coming out. I haven't actually seen it. So.
Those guys also bought Pyre, my publisher, or my former publisher. What can I say? They seem to be mostly interested in acquiring rights.
Mm-hmm.
For what nefarious purpose, I have no idea.
So Chris, isn't the premise with Kane, isn't like although I don't know Wagner actually comes out and say, but isn't he literally supposed to be Kane as in Cain, not Kane?
Yeah, basically, yes, though that's never distinctly said, nor is it a perfect alignment between our version and his. Clearly, there's some commonality in there.
Okay.
The myths may be mixed up from one to the other.
Mm-hmm.
The stories are dark and really gripping. If you like that sort of dark gothic sword and sorcery, they're kind of cornerstones. It's really unfortunate. I was thinking, and I believe Centipede Press, which does really deluxe, beautiful
I love
editions.
them. Yeah.
I think they came out with some versions of Kane not that long ago. But again, because it's Centipede, they're not paperbacks you can just pick up. They're beautiful works of art that cost no small amount and sit on your shelf to be kind of admired.
All right, and have like a 200 copy run, because so
there you go.
Are they the ones that did that beautiful Ray Bradbury, all of the Martian stories, like for $300? I wanted it so bad and couldn't imagine spending that much. Is that them or is that somebody else?
That sounds like them.
It's possible, yeah. They've been getting me for the Lankmar stories. They're reprinting them, so, and they're gorgeous books, and so I have to.
I understand.
Yeah. I brought in. I was actually looking to get the old old Jeffrey Press. That was my introduction to the Lankmar one. They were the orange cover underneath the dust cover, and my actually college library had them, of all things. And so I was actually introduced into Liber through the Knight and Knave of Swords, which is pretty much the worst way to be introduced into it. He's not his strongest work. So the fact that I ended up to be a fan is a testament to either me or Liber or both of us. So
he's always interesting.
Greg Press. That's what it was, not Jeffrey Press. Greg Press.
Okay.
What were you going to say, James?
He's always interesting. What does he say somewhere? Writing is the one business where being senile or even crazy might actually help. I mean, as he got older and older, his fiction got weirder and weirder. You know, so like Catch That Zeppelin. Now that I'm older myself, I recognize the kind of foggy thinking that you get as you get older. But he made it into amazing fiction about worlds changing. You know, he was amazing. He was at least 3 or 4 of the greatest science fiction fantasy writers of the 20th century.
Right. I mean, I'm as much as a huge fan I am of the Fafner and Grey Master Tales, I still think Our Lady of Darkness is one of his best stories ever. And you know, if you've just read his because that's all his most personal. You know, that's also his most personal story. You know, that was him working out all his demons after his first wife died, and he had plunged into the depths of alcoholism, and you know, him kind of dealing with that. And Clark Ashton Smith is a secondary character in that, so where you can go wrong with that? You get 2 great tastes for one. So.
Ambrose Bierce, Dashiell Hammett, all these San Francisco people show up in the backstory. I just reread the novelization or the serialization, The Pale Brown Thing, in some copies of fantasy and science fiction I have over there. But God, I love that story. I can never get it.
If you're out there, if you're watching this and you just know Fafner or Grey Mouse, or track down a copy of Our Lady of Darkness, and you can, if you're lucky, you get Our Lady of Darkness and Conjure Wife as a 2-for-1 in one book, and that's there you go. There's a good week's worth of entertainment for you. You know?
Yeah, and a bunch of urban horror, dark fantasy like Smoke Ghost.
Right.
It's superb, right on.
Science fiction like Pale of Air or the Change War stories.
Oh, Pale of Air, that's a great one. That's one of those ones you're like what? And then you read like that's like the stupidest thing I've ever read, and then you read it like, oh wow, this is pretty deep. You know, this is there's a lot going on in this story.
There's been a best of Fritz Leiber volume of any kind, has there?
There was the Worlds of Fritz Leiber, which was published, I think, in the early, like, might have been 82 or 84, around there.
It was 80s, right?
Right. You can still track it down, and if you can, it's a good investment.
Yeah.
And in the 1970s, that was like the second, I think, of the Ballantine best of collections. But it really isn't the best of Fritz Leiber. I mean, it has some pretty good Fritz Leiber in it. But for one thing, he kept on writing brilliant stories. So some of the, like Catch That Zeppelin, hadn't been written when that book was published. And there's a selected stories by Jonathan Strahan, came out just a few years ago. I forget who the publisher was, but maybe it was called The Essential Fritz Leiber or something like that.
Yeah.
You're mentioning the Smoke Ghost kind of triggered my memory that I think Leiber's underrated for his horror fiction. A handful of things he did for Unknown and other pulp mags back in the day. Girl with the Hungry Eyes.
Oh God, yeah.
The automatic pistol.
Feed me, baby, feed me.
Yeah, that bit, you'd never forget that, do you? You read that line and it sticks in your brain for the rest of your life. That Smoke Ghost automatic pistol, unforgettable work, really.
And another guy who wrote super interesting sentences. Informed by his dad's his dad is another piece of work, evidently, but his dad's Shakespearean career, just all these different things he was interested in. He put science fiction in his fantasy and science fiction. A Spectre is Haunting Texas. That's a great political satire set in the deep future after a nuclear war. God, some great stuff.
That's why I love, out of the Fafner and Grey Mastermind, Lean Times and Lankmar is my favorite one, because it's just the whole Street of the Gods is such a commentary not only on religion, but that's also Fritz talking about like fame, just having grown up, like, be adjacent to the theater and having so many friends when he was living in Los Angeles who were actors and stuff, seeing that whole progression of the rising of your star and then the ebbing of your star. You come from nowhere and you work your way up the street, and then suddenly the jobs stop coming and you work your way back down the street, you go out the gates back into the desert, nobody ever hears from you again. So
right. It's not a story by a young man. It's a story by a middle-aged man who's known some disappointment. That's the one where doesn't the Gray Mouser develop a pot belly in that one?
Yes.
That's great.
Oh God, he
That's
was
that whole Isaac of the Jug thing where Fafhrd becomes a cultist of Isaac of the Jug. Yeah, where's my jug?
My jug. That's it. Yeah, there's I think it's the start of it's no, not the start of Rime Isle, the site of the Frostmont Stream. Fafhrd and the Mouser are in the Silver Eel, and they're just talking, and Fafhrd is just like, he says, Mouser, I have never owned land, I have never commanded men. He's looking back and he's realizing that he's getting older. And it's just, when I was younger I read that and I'm like, okay, whatever. And then like the last couple of times I read that, it's like, I am beginning to identify with Fafnir here, looking back on what I've done in my youth and realizing maybe I should have done more with my life. So
we're putting together a great list here, guys. It's kind of incredible, all the stuff that's coming out of this conversation. And it's funny hearing you mention these great works, and I get so disappointed when I find out the only copy available is, a collectible that's $500 on eBay. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff that needs to come back in some sort of paperback form, or, in the good old days when you had the cheap paperbacks that were, I don't know, 50 cents or whatever they were back in the 70s.
If only we knew a publisher.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, because I think about Centipede, their books are, you're right, like the cheapest one in their, and I have a bunch on the shelf right behind me, but the cheapest one in their, library is like $75, maybe $65, and then the fancy ones, like, yeah, they're just too expensive. We need but I'm sure that, to your point, whoever said it earlier, that, print runs aren't what they used to be. Like, maybe that's what you need to do to sell a print run these days, because you're not printing whatever I keep pointing over here because I have a bunch of paperbacks here. But yeah, if they used to make 30,000 copies of every paperback, and now it's a lot fewer.
The distribution system is so strange now for books. Now that, and with Barnes and Noble apparently going bust, I mean, it's all going to be via the internet.
Not gone bust yet.
Oh, you think there's life in the old girl yet?
I work directly with Barnes and Noble. They're not dead yet, I promise.
Cool. Good.
But
I mean, the fact that
buy some stock,
the fact that they're so central is actually, indicates the problem, though. I mean, there just used to be so many more bookstores and so many places outside of bookstores where you could get books. Just, paperbacks on racks in drugstores and stuff. Now there aren't hardly any drugstores.
Yeah. Although the flip side is
like they used to. I mean,
I know.
I work in publishing. I've worked with books my entire life. I could get up on the soapbox, but I'll avoid that. But if there's just too many choices, especially for young people that don't involve reading. When we were growing up, arguably one of the most thrilling ways you could spend your spare time was reading a book. That's just no longer so. There's too many other choices, much more immediate, much more in your face. So, give a young person a good, very readable, very arresting book. That's the only thing that's going to do it.
Now, one of you guys turned me on to, there's obviously the Gutenberg Project, which has tons of awesome classic fantasy, everything really for free. I feel like I read the Windigo by Algernon Blackwood, I believe is on the Gutenberg Project. I believe that's where I first read it. Then I eventually tracked down a copy, but it's really hard to buy a copy of that book, or that was my experience.
I think Dover still might have a version of Algernon Blackwood's best horror stories. If you like the Wendigo, did you read The Willows?
I just read that like a couple months ago. Yeah. It's
Lovecraft's favorite horror story.
Yeah.
Maybe it's good. I don't know.
Oh, it's good. It's really creepy.
It's magnificent. I'm being sarcastic.
Oh, there you go.
You get the Penguin Classics version of it, so of Algernon Blackwood.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, you can you can find this, and it has the Willows, it has the Insanity of Jones, Ancient Sorceries, the Wendigo, the Glamour of the Snow, the man whom the trees loved. So it's a lot of his good stuff in there.
Yeah. It was the Willows is interesting. It is. I mean, it's basically a horror story about camping on an island. It's like, how do you make that horrific? But it really is every just creepier and creepier. And you never quite understand what's going on. It's well done.
That was Lovecraft's favorite horror story. He thought that was the most terrifying horror story he had ever read.
Yeah, the whole sense of something impinging on our world that's completely other
Yeah.
is really present in that story. That cosmic horror. It's not an old book. It's not a tentacle-faced monstrosity. It's something you can't understand. That doesn't fit into this world at all, and made pretty frightening.
And the little like pits that keep appearing in the sand and then in the corpse, and like, at least I never understood whatever this thing is that's coming into our world is doing weird stuff that doesn't make any sense, and it's just creepy. Yeah, I forget the name of the publisher. Somebody did Beehive Books. Beehive Books did a heavily illustrated version of Algernon Blackwood, I guess about a year ago. But it was, again, like we were talking about, oversized, special edition, pretty expensive. It's too bad there's not a more affordable edition out there.
Some of this public domain stuff you can get in e-versions pretty easily.
Yeah.
Archive.org is getting a lot of bad press lately because they stupidly violated a bunch of people's copyright. But for public domain stuff, they have, if you can stand to read in PDF, they have a lot of stuff. Personally, I like reading in PDF, especially with a tablet. But that maybe it's an acquired taste.
Yeah, I'm more of a physical book. I like to hold the physical item in my hand.
That's number one, definitely.
Yeah.
On the other hand, free is good.
That's a good point. Yes.
I don't know, because I work so much on my laptop, I don't want to read on it. It feels like I'm on a job. I prefer to curl up in the reading chair with the book in hand. That's what makes me happy. Old school.
Some of this stuff is so hard to find that I was just overjoyed to find it in any condition. Falling pulp pages that were falling apart, someone's typewritten mimeographed copy, on the, remember the old purple stuff? Yeah. Whatever I could find. I forget how I finally read the first of the Arthur D. Howdman Smith Grey Maiden stories. It wasn't in that collection that was reprinted. I found someone's old tattered typed copy of it. The first one's called The Forging, and it's how Grey Maiden, the great sword, gets forged for this pharaoh. Now, of course, you can find a perfectly fine copy through, God, who did it? I think
Altus Steger.
I think Altus did the complete Grey Maiden cycle, so you can get all of them. But for a while there, the only way to get the first one, I think, was to buy the go buy the magazine that he carried it, an old copy of Adventure.
Wow, that's old school.
Yeah. So it's a lot easier now to find this good old stuff than it was just even 10, let alone 20 years ago.
Yeah. So, Chris, you just mentioned Steger Press. I am on their mailing list solely for the inspirational book titles. They have by far the most outlandish pulp titles in their line. I was quoting some to Howard the other day, but I just got their latest email. I think this was yesterday or today.
You're probably talking about some Operator 5 and some Spider magazines, right?
Yes. They have a spider, and it's like, I got this email this morning called The Devil's Death Dwarfs. It's like they have the most...
I'm unashamed to admit I read that one, yeah.
You did read that one?
Sure. I used to read a lot of Spider. I like those.
Is it as good as the title? I mean, the titles are amazing.
Yeah, actually, that is the Spider, right?
Yeah, that one is. Yeah, it is the Spider. Yeah.
Yeah, the Spider is some of the only hero pulp in which, if you looked at the ridiculously lurid title and the ridiculously lurid cover, you could be reasonably certain that the prose inside would be just as lurid. A lot of other pulps of the era promised a little more on the cover and the title than they delivered, but the Spider brings it home. It's just as wild as it's going to be.
What a maniac.
Well, because like the titles, I'm going to read off some more titles from their recent releases. The Monster Murders, House of Walking Corpses, The Cholera King, Green Globes of Death, Slaves of the Murder Syndicate, The Mayor of Hell. It's just Death Reign of the Vampire King. Like,
I've read that one too.
Yeah, these titles are terrific.
Are you sure you're not reading the Paperback Paradise list of titles there?
I know. That's another good
guys. This is good reading. Come on.
Oh, yeah. Blood Reign of the Dictator, March of the Flame Marauders, Legions of the Deathmaster. Yeah, man. I mean, these are just like, it's such pure pulp, Like, it's
unadulterated.
Yeah.
I love the one where giant robots attack Manhattan
Yes, indeed. There's
for no real clear reason. What is that? Robot Titans?
Well, if you're looking for like real densely woven plots, you'll probably be disappointed. If you're looking for wild action, and that one, the spider fights a robot at night on the bottom of the East River. So you won't be disappointed if you're looking for ridiculously outrageous action.
There's a trilogy about a fascist takeover in New York State, the Black Police trilogy, which was collected by I've got it around here somewhere. Those, I mean, like any piece of serial fiction, it doesn't really have a conclusion. But God, that's interesting stuff. That's a great one.
That's great.
Autographed.
By the artist, not by the author.
By the artist.
Wow!
Autographed by Jim Steranko, who did the cover, and that's nothing to be.
That's pretty cool.
But Norvell Page has been dead for a long time.
These are all one of those cases where you start going on the plot, and the plot gets weirder and weirder and weirder until it goes into the realm of just complete implausibility. But you just keep pushing it, and then it goes through implausibility and comes swinging back into absolute, just greatness again.
No, I'm with you. It's like, can you imagine the conversation between the editor and the author? And the author's like, I got giant robots invading Manhattan, at night. And the editor's like, that's not good enough. They need to be underwater at night. And it's like,
I think the editor probably just said, okay, can you get it to me by Tuesday?
Right.
I mean, those things, Norvell Page wrote just incredible amounts of fiction. Is he on Appendix N? He did write a couple of sword and sorcery books.
He's not, no.
Flame Winds, right? And the Sons of the Bear Gods.
Yeah, the two Prester John novels, yeah.
Yeah, or as I think of them, hey, I read Genghis Khan. Here, I'll write a fantasy novel about it.
Both those were Conanized by Roy Thomas into Conan the Barbarian comics back in the early '80s, I think.
Crazy. I did not know that.
I gained a new appreciation of Roy Thomas, I guess, over the last couple of years, mostly reading about the Conan series. I mean, I read the comics and never fully appreciated how much they went into the roots of, I guess, pulp and sci-fi just to draw inspiration from.
I'm hardcore. I've been reading those since I was a youngster. And Roy Thomas did really great work in it, and I don't know if he's been completely recognized for it yet. His adaptations were head and shoulders above just about anything else on the racks back in the day.
Yeah,
he tried to treat Conan honorably. The creation, trying to treat it, how to say it? Yeah, I guess not as though he thought Conan himself was necessarily an honorable dude. He just treated the character in an honorable way. He tried to do justice to him in all of his depictions. If he adapted it from another source, he altered the source to make Conan more Conan-like than he was in like the pastiche he was adapting, or he'd alter the Flame Winds to make it a Conan tale, and he tried to be consistent with his depiction of Conan. He tried to be consistent with the Hyborian age.
And there's a crux right there. None of those that followed him, not to name names or really slander anybody, could carry that mantle. He really understood the Hyborian age and told stories set within it that fit with Howard's other work. It's pretty remarkable achievement, I think.
Yeah, all hail to Roy Thomas. I think he really appreciated Robert E. Howard and tried to play fair by him and his creation.
Right on.
and he handled that comic series for like
10 years.
10 years. It was quite a while. Yeah.
70 to 80, then went away and came back for a short time for the end, for Marvel lost it the first time around.
Yeah, there was Marvel actually did a hardback, The Art of Conan the Barbarian, which came out I think last year, which I picked up, and it was just kind of, it's rare that you don't often get comic panels collected in art books, but it was a lot of basically comic panels and some of the most amazing spreads and full pagers and comic panels, and it was really good, pretty impressive collection of art.
Clark Ashton Smith.
Oh, that'll make John Foltz happy.
Yeah, you got to talk Clark Ashton Smith.
I've been sort of reading the chat list.
Yeah.
With Smith is one of the ones, right, that everybody wonders kind of like why he wasn't in Appendix N, because you'd think that Gygax would have read him, would have been a little easier to read back then. than some of the others that made it. So I'm a little surprised he's not on board.
I mean, I wonder in retrospect if his work was just out of print at that time, because I think Arkham House brought some of it back, but it pretty much faded away.
Now that I think of it, I guess most of it was from the Ballantine Adult Fantasy series that was when it was able then. So maybe he didn't get his chance to get his hands on those.
I have heard stories from secondhand, and I might be muddled thing, is that he was introduced through Rob Kuntz, who was part of his wargaming group at that point. And I don't know if it was just like he introduced him to Clark Ashton Smith after the kind of intellectual concrete had already set for what became Appendix N, or if maybe just Gygax didn't enjoy the kind of prose poetry that Smith writes in. I don't know for certain, but I know he was aware of it, but he might have become aware of it a little too late. I think that might have been the issue. But yeah, definitely, I think the world would have been a better place if he had been introduced to Smith a little earlier, and had rooted further into his subconsciousness when he was working on fantasy role playing games. So
yeah, I think that this is like D&D trivia. Like, where's James Malajewski when you need him? But I'm pretty or this might be a John Peterson thing. I'm pretty sure a later version of D&D actually listed Clark Ashton Smith in the inspirational bibliography. I think it was the Mincer
the Tom Moldvade list.
Okay, was that it? Yeah.
In the basic D&D set that he edited, he had his own Appendix N, but Smith is listed in here because obviously after Castle Amber, we knew that Moldvade was a fan. But that one is actually more it's more in depth than just the Appendix N, because Moldvade actually also breaks it down into juvenile literature and adult literature. So okay. I mean, there's probably 100 titles in his version compared to the 23 or 25 however authors we get in Gygax.
If you guys were going to point someone to starting with some Clark Ashton Smith, I've always been kind of partial to the Zothique stuff, but where would you send them if you wanted to try the most approachable Smith? And we haven't really discussed what his prose is like outside it's dense with poetry. What do you want to say about it?
Well, it's sort of a sticking point for some folks. I think we have to admit it's so colorful and lush and dense that some people just they have to might have to stop and look up a word.
A lot of words.
Horrors.
Yes.
That's not a bad thing. And especially when he delivers such powerfully strange atmosphere as he does. One of the things I'm used to accustomed to doing is sort of defending Smith as kind of a sword and sorcery author. Those that want to think of him as just straight up, I don't know, fantasy. The sort of genre hair splitting tends to, I don't know, kind of rub me the wrong way, But I would always recommend The Charnel God. Are you familiar with that story?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that strikes me as a pretty good entry point, and it's undeniably sword and sorcery. Even if you're pretty much of a hardcore sword and sorcery purist, I think that one would reach you. And I wanted to talk about this, so I kept on bringing up Clark Ashton Smith, because I always imagined that Robert E. Howard, paging through the March 1934 issue of Weird Tales, would have read the Charnel God in there and thought it was really cool. This was just what I thought till I read in Howard's letters. He did exactly that. So Robert E. Howard says that story is really a tremendously powerful thing. Sinister figures moving mysteriously against a black background of subtle horror. I don't know when I read anything I admired more, says Robert E. Howard.
Mm.
So The Charnel God, guys, look it up. It's a good one. And maybe that could be like if you're not used to CAS's extravagant style, maybe that would help make the leap. It's worth it. It's great stuff.
I like a lot. I always have to take them in small doses because it's so rich and dense.
Yeah, exactly.
I've acquainted into like I don't know, a box of Christmas chocolates, right? Or some really excellent fudge. I want like 1 or 2 pieces and I'm done for a little while, right? So like a big collection of Clark Ashton Smith stories, I might only read one and then it might be another week before I dip back in. I'll want to go read something else.
When people ask me if where they should come into Clark Ashton Smith, I always recommend, I believe it's still in print, and if it's not, it's been recent enough that it's easy to get in touch with, but there was a collection called The Return of the Sorcerer that was put out maybe about 8-10 years ago. And that has like a lot of his greatest hits in various different genres. And it's a really good, it's a good way to kind of dip your toes in there, because some of them are horror, some of them are kind of fantasy, some of them are kind of sci-fi, so it's like a sampler box of C.A. Smith. So
Chris, did you just go grab a copy?
I thought I had it on right there, and I don't. So I have the book. I don't have it handy.
I have it
I
downstairs.
lent my copy out to somebody. That's what I did. I never got it back. So I'm hoping that it's making the rounds somewhere. So.
Yeah, it's funny. I've read a lot of him, but I agree with you, Howard. It is really dense isn't the right word. Like it's engrossing, but it's somehow like it's just it fills my whole head. Like I can't. It's so rich. I can only read one story every so often. Yeah.
Well, I tend to.
I love it, but it's just dense.
I love it too. The thing that bothers me, I think the reason I can't read too many in a row, another reason is that you don't get attached to the characters very much. The characters most of the time are kind of incidental to everything else that's going on. And I think I prefer more character-based stuff. So it may not be for everyone. He's very distinctive. He's brilliant. He's incredibly talented. He's wildly inventive and kind of alarmingly grisly, right? But yeah, not quite my cup, but I do like him.
But I think part of the problem might be is a lot of the characters that show up in C.S. Smith aren't exactly likable. They're kind of like the Kugel the clever, phenomenon. It's just, I mean, so when they get their comeuppance, at the end, their second shadow kills them, or the thing falls on their head in the tomb on Mars or whatever. I mean, so they're not exactly likable characters. And then you have, his very rich palette of words on top of that. So I can see where it'd be kind of easy, especially if you're more character driven, that I can see the difficulty in that. But
actually, Mike,
go ahead.
So that's a great point. It's all about the atmosphere with him, and there's plot. And you're right, the characters, I can't even remember most of their names, but I remember what happened to somebody in that story.
Probably something bad happened to somebody.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a 75% chance they had it coming.
And then I can pronounce the names frequently. I had to just Google the name of the thief who loses his finger, whatever it is. Satampra Zeros.
What's the one about that sorcerer who transforms people in that hideous garden? That one was really.
Oh yeah. I believe Pagana Press reprinted that one just last year or two ago. I have it on the shelf back there, but I can't remember the name of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was the opening story in one of those old Valentines that Dylan Carter edited.
Yeah, where he had the garden and like all the plants had like, hands on them because they'd been like, is that the story you mean? That was,
sure, yeah.
Yeah, that was a good one.
I think he was a huge influence on Vance. The dying world stuff, but also the creepy magician's garden. Mazirian the magician has a creepy garden. And some of Vance is, I find Vance much easier to read, a cleaner, drier, more ironic style. But he's very interested in using the weird word if he thinks it's the right word. So I think Vance would probably deny being influenced by anybody, but I think I see a shadow of Smith on Vance.
I think it's the Garden of Adolpha is the one you're talking about.
That's right.
I see. So does John Foltz. Garden of Adolpha it is.
Oh, there. Okay, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Go to John for your for all your Clark Ashton Smith needs.
Now, here's some fun facts. You guys probably know this, but Clark Ashton Smith was also a sculptor and an artist. And Centipede did a book of his art, I guess a couple of years ago. But Mr. Michael Curtis here actually just adapted Castle Amber to D&D 5th edition, which we'll be publishing in a little while. So he wrote some very good introductory articles about Clark Ashton Smith. But then Doug Kovacs is doing some art for that, illustrating Clark Ashton Smith's works. And I guess my point here is I've loaned my copy of that book to Doug, and now I wish I had it here to show you. Anyway, Doug's got my book of Clark Ashton Smith art, but it's really cool. If you're a fan of his writing, check out the book. It's just, I wouldn't call it, it's not technically brilliant art. Like, it's not like, renderings that look, just like real life or something, but it's just weird art. In the same way his writing is just weird writing, and, he has black skies and weird purple plants and strange sculptures, and all just is creepy art in the same way that his writing is creepy writing in like a very atmospheric way.
He used to carve when he was living in Auburn. He used to carve like stones and kind of like weird, kind of like idol looking things like the Sagawa and stuff. And something would keep it. Something he would get done and would just throw into the woods. So like, I actually spent 9 weeks in Auburn, when I was working in the movie industry, and I would have loved to just like wander around the woods one day trying to find like a C.S. Smith, like carved, idol that was now overgrown with moss and everything because it'd been 70 years or whatever. That talk about a trinket to bring home. Look, I found an idol, Mom.
Don't touch that. You don't know where it's been.
Yeah. And he was incredibly prolific he wrote for about 5 years and then he was done. Like after R.E. Howard died and after Lovecraft died, the wind just kind of went out of his sails, and his parents got sick and he had to take care of them and everything, and went back to poetry for so.
He was a real character. I mean, I don't know a lot about him, but from what I've read about him, I don't know the name of the guy, but the guy who founded like the American Satanist movement used to hang out with Clark Ashton Smith, which would explain some of the writing. But he ran in some interesting circles. Yeah,
he was pretty much self-taught. He had to drop out of school, and like he read the Encyclopedia Britannica cover to cover, and read like the OED, and like that's how he learned. So you don't get that a lot.
LaVey has been suggested for the guy, the Satanist guy.
Oh, okay. Actually, that's John Foltz. I didn't know there was a gargoyle sculpture of Clark Ashton Smith in Auburn. I've driven through Auburn on the way to somewhere in the last year. Didn't have time to stop, but now I'll have to stop, I guess.
You probably went through there on the way to Reno for Gamma.
Oh, that's right. That's the game industry trade show, for those of you who don't know. But you're probably right. That is probably...
Yeah. That's where I know where Reno is, because those 9 weeks I spent in Auburn, because I know that was just up the road. So
yeah.
Hey, John Foltz, do you have this? Yeah, this is a cassette from Necronomicon Press, and it has Clark Ashton Smith reading some of his poetry.
Seriously?
Yeah, it's not the highest quality. Obviously, just done on a tape recorder, way back in the day. But there's some good stuff on there. And as far as I know, it just showed up on cassette, what, big Lord, 20-odd years ago. Awesome stuff. In tones. In theory, they say that like when he wrote, he wandered around the woods in Auburn reading what he was writing aloud, trying to make sure it sounded right and cool enough. So, he has some experience reading his stuff out loud, and it's pretty haunting.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. That's like the stories of Robert E. Howard, where he apparently would shout at his typewriter, as he typed, articulating his stories. So
I think that's a good discipline, actually, reading a story aloud. Whether it has dialogue or not, I think it lets me know whether something is wrong with the sentence or not.
Yeah.
Well, it jumps out. The word echo and word choice and flow. Yeah, once you read it out loud, before I finally submit a story to the publisher or the editor or whatever, I always read it out loud fun to fun.
Interesting.
Word echo, my God, that's my kryptonite. I feel like there are passages where I use the same word, like 5 times in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the? I hate it when they use the.
The is okay. Said.
Yeah, and your dialogue. If you have bad dialogue, you'll know when you read it out loud. All of a sudden, what sounded cool on the page sounds really awful coming out of your mouth.
That was your dialogue there, sir. That's it.
Apparently, that's when what's his name, Chandler. I'll never forget what's his name. Chandler wrote the script for Double Indemnity. They had to change all the dialogue because Kane's dialogue looked great on the page, but when people said it aloud, it didn't sound right.
Interesting.
Oh, wow.
That's what Harrison Ford just said to George Lucas. It's like, George, you can write this shit, but you can't say it. That's like.
That's funny. I mean, there's a Pagana Press, which is the guys. Do you guys know Pagana Press?
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, another small press that does fabulous work that's quite expensive. That's what these are. They actually, I believe they still do all the typesetting by hand, like old school, like, rearranging little metal letters on the press. I mean, Gutenberg style, I guess. Yeah.
It's all block painting. They carve out of a block of wood themselves, each individual letter, and they.
Well, I mean, I love their work, but it takes I have something that's been on order for like 5 months because they sent me an update recently that they're I guess smushing it with wooden blocks to flatten the paper or something, which is some step in the manufacturing process, but it's old school. Anyway, my point was that the main guy there, I guess, used to work in voice acting or something. He has an amazing voice. So they started a podcast, and they're now doing read-alouds of, I believe they did a Clark Ashton Smith read-aloud story, but they definitely did an audio version of a Lord Dunsany story. It's pretty cool. Something to listen to for those of you who want to listen to audio versions of some of these stories.
I do think Dunsany reads aloud real well.
Yeah, he does.
I would hesitate to read him aloud because I feel like should be done with someone with an Oxford, Eton sort of accent. But it's very fluid, even when he's using all those weird exotic names that Lynn Carter loves so much.
Maybe we should talk Dunsany a little bit.
Good call. Yeah.
I think that a lot of times when people latch onto Dunsany, unfortunately, I think they latch on to some of the novels because people want to read longer works rather than the short story collections. Not that there's anything wrong with the novels, but I think that some of his short stories are where the real gold is, especially the first few of the short story collections. Although in the original 6 or 8 short story collections, there's gems in all of them, but it gets less fantastical as he goes. And the first of them, I think maybe a little too much of the false mythology. I don't enjoy it as much as the ones that come immediately after the first one. And once again, I think my favorite edition is by the same Golax publisher that did the bracket volume, the Fantasy Masterworks. This is Time and the Gods by Lord Dunsany. And this collects everything in the first 6 short story collections. And they're glorious. Of course, if you're looking for continuing characters, you're not going to find them. Most of the stories are quite short, no more than, a lot of them are less than a few thousand words. So if there's one that doesn't take you quite as, that you don't like as well, it'll be over. And you can just go on, right? It's like trying out a box of chocolates, not to sound like Forrest Gump, but well, that one didn't taste as good. Well, tomorrow I'll try this other flavor. Brilliant and beautiful and inventive. And, a lot of times when people recommend older speculative fiction, like say Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury is great. I still think he's great. I don't mean to malign him, but you read it now, it's like, oh, well, I saw that twist coming, or, oh, that's where that idea comes from. Well, back when Ray Bradbury wrote those, and for years later, people didn't see the twist coming because he's the one that kind of did that first, right? Like the guy that accidentally goes back in time and steps on something and changes future history. Well, Ray Bradbury did that first. So just because you read the story and see it coming, unfortunately, it's ruined now because the stuff that Ray Bradbury came up with, we all know now. But the Dunsany stuff still surprises. And I don't know. It's kind of like Ray Bradbury in a way, because there's so many different little short stories about different little things that are inventive and weird and full of poetic language, but different in that it hasn't so completely permeated our all the genres that we know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's well put.
He's another guy with a wry sense of humor, but a taste for horror. Yeah. And combines them niftily. And he wrote a whole bunch of different kinds of stuff. I mean, he wrote memoirs of his experiences in World War I. Those are not lighthearted stories. He wrote really gruesome murder mysteries. Two Bottles of Relish is the one that you.
That I was just thinking that one. That is I'm surprised that one even got printed when at the time that he wrote that.
I just reread it and I kept on thinking, how did he get away with that? And the Jorkin stories are super funny, and a lot of them impinge on fantasy in different ways. But those first 5 books, he doesn't repeat because he's got too many ideas in his head and he's throwing them all down on it. He goes up into his tower and on his estate and he writes, and he just throws all those ideas down on paper.
Well, kind of like Vance or I guess a modern day author like that, Gaiman. just tossing out these great ideas off the top of the cuffs, like, wow, someone else will write an entire story about that. And he just throws it away in a single sentence and moves on to the next one. You know, it's just beautiful stuff. Yeah.
And when he does repeat, it's significant. Like there's the pirate story, the pirate shard. He comes back for a sequel.
That's right. He does appear a second time. I forgot about that. I think that's the
there's the one about the floating island, and then there's the one where he escapes by putting a ship on wheels and sailing over North Africa. But I think, you know, one of the reasons why I think that those twists still catch you is because you can know what's coming, and the audacity of someone trying to pull that crap off in his story is still amazing, even if you know it's coming.
It's been my experience with Dunsany is he's one of those authors that I come back to at different points in my life, and I appreciate it on a different level than I was when I read it the first time. You know, I think just one of the last read through, I forget the title of it, but it was about the man, it was the general who lays siege to the Castle Time. And you know, he and his troops are basically they're attacking the Castle Time, and his troops are aging and all the rest of it. And it's just such a great meditation on just growing older and just, you know, watching your youth pass away and everything. And it's just, you know, like obviously when I was much younger I read that, I was like, oh, that's a, you know, interesting little story. And then coming back to it 10 years later, I appreciate it on a much deeper level. And I'm sure in 10 more years when I come back to it, it'll be, you know, I'll be appreciating on a yet a deeper level. So yeah,
They're wonderfully entertaining, but they're about stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like the coronation of Thomas Shapp, which is where the guy lets a little imagination into his life and eventually he ends up going crazy. Spoilers. But in a way, it's not a fantasy at all, but it's about fantasy. He's sneaky.
You know, to take it back to one of our earlier authors, Lynn Carter, of course, adapted a bunch of, didn't adapt, he collected a bunch of Lord Dunsany into collections for the Ballantine series, and he did a really nice job. He wouldn't just take it from the primary, you know, the first 6 or so that we're talking about. He would occasionally pull like a fantastical play and put it in these Dunsany collections, or poems, or bits of this or that, you know, a single Jorkin story or whatever else. Those were really nicely done because it was a sampling just to show you all that Dunsany was capable of. There's a really interesting play that he did about kings. Apparently he was also a playwright, and he wrote chess stories, and he was a chess grandmaster. Lord Dunsany was a really interesting fellow.
I didn't know all that. The most
a collateral of mine, as one of my friends points out in the chat window. My Irish ancestors go back to the Plunketts, and that's the Dunsany family name.
Yeah.
Maybe my ancestors were just serfs on the Plunketts.
Nah, you got some of that blood.
You know, his estate's still around, and Pagana has done a series. I think they're on volume 5 of. I guess the estate keeps finding unpublished Dunsany stories, and Pagana's doing books of these.
Yeah, I know. I'd love to read those, but the editions are quite expensive.
I know. I've got one. It had some good stories in it, but yeah, they're quite expensive. But it's neat just to have new material coming out, I guess 100 years later, that they, I guess, uncovered somewhere in the estate, somewhere in the castle.
A lot of draws, you know. Hey, look what's in this one, you know. Yeah. Opening up like, you know, a cookbook and find, hey, look, he's got one in here. And, you know. Like, unfortunately, like, you know, like Liber, like all his early stuff is, you know, I think he either lost it or sold it to collectors when he was like in the depths of alcoholism. So, you know, that was the one about going down to the collection in Houston. Like like none of his early stories were in there. Like everything was from like the 70s or on, because the drafts were either gone or, you know, in somebody's private hands. We'll never see the light of day again.
Mm.
We have so much to be thankful for with the Robert E. Howard stuff, that it was preserved and that Glenn Lord tracked it down, because so much of it had been loaned out of that out of the big chest where it all been kept after his death. Glenn Lord tracked that all down. All praise to Glenn Lord. There's another sad story about Harold Lamb, his son. There were all these old manuscripts and boxes full of letters and unpublished stories, and he stored it in a garage and it got so badly weather damaged that when the executors of the state came after Fred Lamb died, there was nothing left. They just had to shovel it out because it was so damaged, and it just heartrending. There was one desk. There was some stuff stored in the desk, and it had been projected against weather. And of course, there's one unpublished book in there, and a couple of old stories, and a script, and some other things. Like, wow, you know, I'd like to get down to UCLA where his archive is and read those someday.
There's a terrible story about C.S. Lewis's literary estate. A claim that the literary executor came to the house after Lewis's death, and the people in the household were just burning a bunch of old papers. There's dispute about whether that's accurate or not. But sometimes I wake up screaming thinking about that, you know. I mean, there was no Tolkien. There was no Christopher Tolkien.
No, yeah. Christopher Tolkien would stab you if you tried to do anything with Dad's stuff, you know.
The last inkling. I was just reading his translation of Hervor and Haedric saga again. God, that guy was a genius in his own right.
He was tremendous. And you know, it's very funny is amongst role players, amongst the old school people who like really into Appendix N, Tolkien doesn't get as much credit. Everybody kind of he's so vanilla fantasy and everything. And you realize this is like, if Tolkien hadn't done his work, I mean, none of the stuff that you were reading, and you know, I mean, it literally, I mean, and you know, out of all of the Appendix N authors, how many of them have like literary, like, you know, like Tolkien studies? You can get a degree in Tolkien studies. Like, you know, you could be a fan of R.E. Howard, but you can't get something to hang on your wall, you know. So
no, you guys have said it really well about Bradbury as well, and Tolkien, that some of these guys influence the mainstream so much that they become like Kleenex or Xerox. They just become an accepted, standardized version of it, and we forget that was new to the world when it first came out, you know.
It's something I call the Jimi Hendrix syndrome. Is that what it is? Because, like, you know, Jimi Hendrix, you know, great guitarist. Everybody knows he's completely talented. Anybody who's been playing guitar for a couple months can play Hendrix. But, you know, it's just like, well, if he's so good, I've only been playing guitar 4 months. How can I play Hendrix? Yeah, but he did it first. So, that's the difference. So.
Yeah. There's a swing to Hendrix that no one else can do, though. Soulfulness, Robin Trower called it. But yeah, and I think a lot of people are familiar with versions of Tolkien rather than Tolkien himself. You know, I've talked to Tolkien fans who say, "Oh, I've never read the books," so they're talking about the movies, and it's like, dude,
you know.
Now there are rubber ducks based on Tolkien's.
I have seen those. Yes.
I practically burst a gasket when I saw that. I'm an old man. What can I tell you?
Well, it's a good thing. A good thing for the professor is dead, because, you know, if not, those would have killed him. You know, that's so.
The letters he exchanged with Forrest Ackerman about, you know, treatments for a movie of Lord of the Rings, they're hilarious. But one doesn't like to imagine what he would be saying if he briefly revisited this mortal plane.
Probably let me out of the box.
And now that Christopher is dead, you know, it's.
Wait, what'd you say, Howard? I missed it.
Let me out of the box, I think.
That's what he'd be saying? Okay, yes. All right, so guys, we're actually closing in on our time limit. This has been a great discussion.
Shouldn't you say something about Tales from the Magician's Skull?
Oh, we should probably mention it. Oh, yes. This
Chill.
Yeah, so
running out of time.
If you want to support more of this stuff in the future, anyway, check out our magazine, Tales from the Magician's Skull. This is number 1. We're up to number 4 in print, and we're working on number 5 right now. Howard, you can see in the lower left-hand corner, is the editor of this, and Chris and James in the 2 corners up here are 2 of the illustrious authors. There's number 4. Yep. And anyway, it's a great magazine, modern swords and sorcery fiction with classic feel. And I'm telling you, this seminar has me excited to like reprint some classic stuff. Maybe we need like a Goodman adult fantasy series. Like it's pretty exciting. It's kind of ambitious though, but there's a lot of great stuff out there that deserves to be better read. That's for sure.
Come up with a different name. I think adult has different connotations now than it did when the Valentine series came out.
Yeah, so does adult fantasy. Like you're right, that would not do well. We'll call it.
You don't.
Well, I mean, it would sell well though. That's the thing.
But it would play havoc on search engines. That's it. Like.
Yeah, you're right. Anyway, thanks guys for just having this chat, and to those who are talking online, we'll definitely pull this together. In like a web post or something, listing all these titles. We'll list all the books you can't buy or that are very expensive to buy. And maybe we'll try to find some cheap resources for them if they're available on, Gutenberg Project or something like that. You guys have any closing comments or any words of wisdom you want to pass on?
Great talking with you.
Yeah, this is a great panel.
This is right.
Yeah,
it's great talking with you guys, and I wish I could have interacted more with the guys in the chat window. They're saying some great stuff about Harlan Ellison and Cyrano and all sorts of great stuff. Kudos to you guys.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go back and reread all the chats too. There's some good stuff there.
It was a pleasure. I didn't even try to be looking at my phone with the window while I was staring at the screen. I was afraid I was going to knock over my poster the whole time by just turning my chair. No, it was a pleasure. There's so many more things we could have talked about. I would have loved to, we talked about influences, and heck, Bradbury was kind of doing a riff on some stuff that Henry Kuttner had been doing. If you read early Bradbury, it sounds a lot like late Kuttner. Kuttner died young, of course, and he's the guy who came up with Elac of Atlantis and Prince Raynor and other sword and sorcery goodies, but he also was writing kind of Ray Bradbury-esque, Ray Bradbury was sort of writing Kuttner-esque stuff, and that Ray Bradbury, of course, once finished a Lee Brackett story that they wrote together that was a Kraken Sword and Planet adventure story. It's weird how all this stuff intertwines.
Yeah, they were all friends. Kuttner, Bradbury, Brackett hung out together.
Yeah.
I think it was Kuttner who told Bradbury to shut up. Because he was talking out all his stories. and Kuttner one day said, "Hey, Ray, shut up. Go home and type." And he did.
That's pretty funny.
Good advice.
Save it for the typewriter. All right, cool. Thanks, guys. That was a lot of fun. Thanks, everybody who took the time to listen to this, and we should do it again sometime.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Great talking with all of you.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, everybody.